just amazing here. My gosh, right? Just a quick reminder that a week from now, we have a bit of a special event that I hope you're all able to make it for. And please do help spread the word all about teaching the workshop's history and methods. This roundtable discussion featuring not only our Ostrom Fellows, but a number of long-term workshoppers. So I'm really excited about that. And we'll also have some special announcements following that event too. So looking forward there. But today we get to feature you finally, Salih, which I'm really excited about. As I said, from political science, of course, a research awardee, and your paper looking here at the Bureaucrat-Local politician relations and hierarchical local government in emerging democracies, a case study of Tunisia, which is, I have to say, a bit of a tongue twister, but a fascinating read. Is going to be a wonderful discussion. So per usual, we'll open it up for questions here following about half an hour, but feel free, as always, to raise hands, use the chat box, and we're going to have a great discussion, I have no doubt. So without further ado, looking at the clock here, over to you, good sir. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon. Can you see my screen?
I think it looks great.
Okay, go. So the title of my presentation is Party Organizations and Hierarchical Local Governance in Emerging Democracies, a case study of Tunisia. So I'm currently in Turkey and internet connection is not great here. So if I disconnect, you can wait me for a couple seconds. And so brief outline of my talk. First, I introduce my puzzle, my theory, framework linking the relations between bureaucracy and local governance officials, the other framework linking citizens' trust in institutions and partisanship. Then I present my case study, my methods, my findings, then I provide a conclusion. So the grand puzzle of my dissertation research is what explains the modes of participatory local governance in emerging democracies. And in this presentation, there are two sub-questions that feed into this grand question, which are, how does political appointments of bureaucrats influence the inclusivity of local governance institutions? And how does the co-partisanship with mayors influence citizens' trust in local governance institutions? I answer these questions through referring to both qualitative and quantitative evidence. So the theory I use is based on distributive and clientele politics in emerging democracies. Parties in emerging democracies often lack easily differentiable policy platforms, focus on catch-all issues, and have volatile electoral shifts. So they are weak on platform-based politics. They are weak on differentiating among themselves on the basis of platforms. Yet they can be quite resourceful regarding distributive and clientele politics, which focuses on resource allocation, such as valence or efficiency, clientele, associations, distribution, and organizational networks, including the networks of political parties. Clientele and distributive politics can enable parties to recruit bureaucrats, control public offices, influence public perception, and access financial resources. And as I argue in this presentation, they can also constitute key elements for shaping the institutional performance. So let's briefly go through some of the key issues in Nidaa, Tounes, and Ennahda's 2014 electoral programs. These two parties were the largest parties in Tunisia by the time of the 2018 local elections. Nidaa is an authoritarian successor party in Tunisia, and Ennahda, authoritarian successor party, referring to a party that inherited the single party regime's ideology and the cadre membership. Ennahda is a conservative party with an Islamist background, and there was a political conflict between these parties by the time I conducted this study. Yet once we look at their political platforms from their 2014 electoral programs, we observe that they more or less focus on the same issues, meaning that regarding industrial policy, fiscal balance, support for cultural production, it is really hard to differentiate these two parties among each other, except for some issues such as unions or Islam, role of Islam that derive from the historical evolution of these parties. So parties are similar with regards to their policy platforms. Yet, what matters, how they differentiate, how these parties differentiate among each other, is their ideology. The well-established ideologies among these parties enable them to distinguish among each other. The ideology in that sense, however, derives from a shared identity, worldview, experiences under authoritarian rule, and in-group and out-group dynamics. So it's distinct from ideology informing industrialized Western democracies that focuses on more class dimensions. In particular, bourguibism is a shared ideology of the regime successor parties in Tunisia, with tenets such as independence, modernity, reformation, and advancing women's rights, including party Nidaa Tounes. And political Islam is the ideology that Ennahda derives from, and political Islam can generate so strong social ties, mutual trust, and serve as a base of mobilization among members of a party. So I argue shared ideology can be highly functional for distributive and clientele politics in emerging democracies, because in emerging democracies, the structure of governance is fit for a top-down governance framework rather than a bottom-up framework. So any attempt for a bottom-up governance attempt creates large transaction costs. So there are high values. The values are high for accessing influential networks, which can determine who gets what. So this figure summarizes the theoretical framework. Ideology centered at the middle defines who is with us, who is against us. And the party networks, of course, shape the boundaries of this ideological connections. And then this framework determines balance, targeted benefits, and party organization. So my framework regarding bureaucrat and local politician relations, I assume that bureaucrats are utility maximizing individuals similar to politicians. And as I mentioned, high transaction costs exist between central and local level in transitioning settings that are fit for a hierarchical manner of governance. And I also assume that non-transparent methods of governance can produce electoral benefits for office holders, because non-transparent methods can enable mayors, for instance, to receive all positive attribution and engage in a targeted service delivery that may not be possible if they were to share the governance responsibilities, and if they were to engage in a transparent method of governance with different stakeholders at the local level. So this framework motivates me to propose two alternative modes of local governance adjusted from Elinor Ostrom's Nobel lecture. So on the one hand, we have a continuation of two-way relationships, the structure of two-way relationships among participants of local governance, as you can see in figure 2. And this is usually what we see in code books, constitutions or local codes, where there is a co-production among an inclusive local governance among different stakeholders. On the other hand, as you see in figure 3, there is a one-way relationship of local governance, where voters elect municipal council elects mayors then engage in some sort of co-production with bureaucrats that produces some benefits for citizens, but citizens are mere clients in that setting. Citizens do not engage in a form of co-governance in that framework. So, and this framework resembles more rules in use or actual rules that we see in emerging democracies. So I hypothesize that political ties can matter. Political ties can structure whether we see figure 2 or figure 3, hierarchical or inclusive manners of governance. Particularly, political ties between mayors and bureaucrats make local governance less open for local stakeholders outside of mayors' political networks. Political appointments enable bureaucrats to develop voluntary networks with local politicians that can enable them to accumulate social capital and reduce transaction costs, provide a better group cohesion based on shared norms, experiences, worldview. And OECD definition emphasizes the transparency of government actions as a part of open governance initiative. So I focus on inclusivity and transparency of local governance. Second, I focus on the factors that motivate citizens' trust in local governance institutions. Three main theories of citizens' trust in institutions are institutional performance, interpersonal trust, and home team effect. Institutional performance theory argues that citizens' trust is a function of institutions performing satisfactorily. Interpersonal trust theory argues that a general disposition of trust towards others can explain citizens' trust in institutions. Finally, home team effect argues that co-partisanship with the office holder can explain whether citizens are co-partisan with the office holder, can explain citizens' trust in institutions. How about local governance institutions in new democracies? Local governance institutions often directly engage with service production and delivery, including in new democracies. However, new democracies can be distinct from industrialized democracies in a sense that the civil society organizations could be weaker and state capacity could be more limited. So local governance institutions, in a sense, could be sometimes the only institution that directly carries implications for citizens' well-being and directly engages with some form of welfare distribution for citizens. And in that environment, party networks can really be the key for who gets what at the local level. Yet, to my knowledge, no study has examined the link between co-partisanship and trust in local governance in new democracies. So partisanship can exert both a direct effect on citizens' trust in local governance due to the home team effect or partisan labeling effect, and an indirect effect due to institutional performance. Partisanship can determine who can access the municipal goods and benefits, because if the competition existed under authoritarian rule, partisan relationship can already develop based on shared norms and ideologies. So co-partisanship can exert a direct effect on trust in institutions on the basis of labeling and prior beliefs among competing parties and individuals who participate in competition. And co-partisanship can also exert an indirect influence through evaluations of institutional performance, as individuals who are co-partisan with their mayors may perceive institutions to perform more satisfactorily, and they can develop greater trust in institutions. So I propose that individuals who are co-partisan with their mayors have greater levels of trust in local governance institutions, as opposed to individuals who are not co-partisan with their mayors. So briefly, case study, Tunisia. Tunisia went through a revolution in 2011, wrote a new constitution in 2014, a new code of local collectives in 2018. This code aspires for a partial decentralization framework. On the one hand, we have elected local officials for the first time in Tunisia's history, engaging planning, financing, and managing local affairs. Particularly, the mayor holds a crucial role within municipalities. Previously, it was the role of the administrative authority, Secretary General. Now, the mayor, the elected official, holds a supreme authority within local councils. On the other hand, we have the continuation of the deconcentrated structure, particularly through the office of the governor, who is appointed by the central government. The governor holds has key authority within the resource distribution structure, as I will show in the next slide. The governor also has some political authority, as it provides oversight over municipalities. Although governors ought to remain impartial, at least some of their appointments are politically motivated, as I will also show in next slides. So the figure here shows the current resource distribution structure in Tunisia for municipalities. I drew this figure from a variety of sources, and you can see that the governor is here. The governor holds the key here in the resource distribution structure because some of the resources allocated from municipalities are evaluated through the office of governor. Furthermore, some of the resources that come from outside grants can go to appropriations, and regional councils are also evaluated through the governors because governors are currently chairing the regional councils. Governors are unelected, they are appointed. Once we look at the municipality self-resources, they are municipality taxes and municipality property. However, many of the municipalities, especially those outside of the capital and high-income regions, lack the capacity to income taxes or resources from municipal property. For many municipalities, central government resources are the only viable option. So, appointment of governors. Here you see a picture of a governor taking an oath. And you see late President Bejikare Sepsi, and you see a very non-partisan, very bureaucratic structure. It's a very bureaucratic image. You don't see any partisan flags, nothing suggesting any party background. Yet once you look at the newspaper archives, you see that at least some of these governors had prior ties to some political parties, or they became affiliated with some political parties after their tenure as governors, suggesting that their appointments were due to bargaining within the cabinet, due to their political connections. So, for instance, a governor of Gabes, a governor in Tunisia, was previously a member of Ennahda party. How can we find this information? If we dug through newspaper archives, we sometimes find pieces of information linking certain governors to political parties. And the resources, regarding resources within municipal bodies, 2018 local collectives suggest that the mayors hold a key authority here within municipalities as they chair both the administrative and political units. Administratively, they chair the Secretary General and the administrative subunits, and politically, they chair the local council. So their partisanship background, their partisan relations can be crucial in terms of the procedures and outcomes of local governance, in a sense that a political conflict can lead them to, can strain their relations with some council members in the local council, which can prevent citizens, which can prevent the functioning of commissions to reach the commission suggestions to make their way all the way to the mayor, for instance. Or if a political conflict exists with the council, mayor can ally itself with the Secretary General to engage, who is an administrative official, to engage in a targeted service delivery. So data collection, I utilize mixed method in this project. I did 64 interviews in Tunisia in 2019 across 6 governorates with civil society, mayors, council members, and the governorate were Sfax, Tounes, Kef, Gabes, Monastir, Kairouan. And quantitatively, I look at the transparency index developed by an independent civil society organization in cooperation with the Ministry of Local Affairs. Then I look at the Arab Barometer survey data on trust in local governance among Tunisians. Aggregate evidence, transparency. Transparency score constitutes my dependent variable. It's a metric-based score coded by experts based on previously set criteria, which I am happy to discuss about in Q&A. 70% of this score is based on respecting the right of information, and 30% based on actual workings, transparency within actual workings of the municipal governance. While the actual score ranges between 0 and 100, the maximum score actually obtained was 69%, and the mean was 25.4%. Looking at distribution of transparency score by mayor's party, we do not observe, it doesn't seem to explain a whole lot of variation, whether mayor was elected from Ennahda, came from an independent list, from leftist or other parties, or from Nidaa Tunis. And trust regarding survey evidence, my dependent variable is again from Arab Barometer, 2018 survey. On the question of please tell me how much trust you have in local government. So I code as 1 if the respondents indicate either great deal or quite a lot of trust, and 0 if they indicate that they do not have at all or not a lot of trust. So as you can see, about 32% of the respondents have quite a lot or a great deal of trust, and about 58% have not at all or not a lot of trust, and the sample size is about 1,600. My independent variable regarding transparency is a categorical variable indicating whether there's a partisan match between governor and mayor. I code as convergence or 1 if there's a partisan match, neutral if mayor is independent, and opposite if they come from the opposite, if their parties come from the opposite background. For instance, the mayor comes from a party with Bourguibist background, and the governor had prior ties with Ennahda, or vice versa. And I also control for population, distance to capital, municipal status, proportion of seats held by the winning party. But let me first go through some descriptive statistics. So breakdown of transparency score by governor's affiliations. First, governor, I identify governor to come from a Bourguibist background. We find that in this case, if mayors come from Ennahda lists, as you see in the red line, they tend to score higher on transparency in comparison to when mayors come from Nidaa Tunis, which is the green bar. There are some exceptions that defy this trend, but this appears to be, and the independents tend to be located in the middle. For instance, in KEF, independents or SPACs, independents tend to be in the middle, and mayors coming from an opposition or opposite ideological background tend to score higher on transparency. Yet, once we switch the table, in this time, governor has affiliation with Ennahda, for instance. We do observe that governors, mayors elected from Nidaa Tunis in municipalities where mayors were elected from Nidaa Tunis tend to have greater transparency scores, and the independents tend to come second, and Ennahda lists tend to come the last. And OLS regression results also lend support to these findings, as transparency score is higher when the governor and the mayor come from opposite backgrounds, as opposed to mayors being independent or governors and mayors sharing co-partisanship or parties with similar ideological backgrounds. And this predicted probabilities, the table also indicates this dynamic, as there's a shift from 22 percentile transparency score to about 30 percentile transparency score. If you consider that the maximum range, maximum actually scored is 68%, this is a substantive increase, I would argue. Finally, next I refer to interview evidence from subjects, suggesting the link between partisanship with governor and inclusivity of local governance. A council member in Gabes says, the governor needs to be equally not to all parties, but in reality, the governor is closer to Ennahda. So our municipality receives more investment. but if not from Ennahda, not investment. So another municipality in Gabes, another council member in the same municipality says the mayor takes decisions only with his party, not with consultation through individuals in other parties, and not only. So another council member in a municipality in Gabes says, the governor is closer to Ennahda. He helps finding resources for the municipality, such as stadium. Ennahda followers attempt to dominate everything. For instance, they do not share information on projects. An example is that the division of commissions was based on voting rather than participatory governance. As a result, Ennahda took all important commissions. So once we look at Monastir, another governorate, in this time, the governor was identified to have ties to the Burgibis parties. A civil society member says, the central government gives more importance to the municipality from Nidaa compared to the other municipalities. If the governor and the mayor are from the same party, they can have better relations. We asked for delegation office in our municipality. The governor chose to establish it here rather than the other regions due to the partisanship ties between the mayor and the governor. Then he adds, we hold the same distance to each party, yet the mayor provides resources to the civil society is closer to him. There is a civil society here that's Burgibis, meaning closer to mayor's ideological connections, and it receives more resources. For the budgetary budgets, there is voting. For other things, the mayor makes decisions by himself. And finally, trust in local governance and partisanship. So in this survey, I matched the party of respondents with the party of their mayor. So the respondents declared the party that they felt closest with. So I matched their party based on their location with the party of their mayor. And I also include control variables regarding some socioeconomic dynamics. So figure 16 provides the descriptive data. We observe that among respondents who are co-partisan with their mayors, they appear to be more likely to trust in local governance as opposed to those who are not co-partisan. So among those trusting local governance, for instance, partisans trusting is about 46%, which is about 35% for those without partisan match. And logistic regression results also provide some evidence for co-partisanship and trust in local governance. For instance, if you look at the post-estimation analysis of partisanship match, whether mayors come from national parties, for instance, we do observe that if there is a match between party of the respondent and the party of the mayor, likelihood of trusting in local governance is about 0.42, which is about 0.35 if there is no partisan match. And the difference among these two levels is substantive at the p-value of 0.05. And also interview evidence provide some evidence that partisanship can exert influence through institutional performance. For instance, mayors can refer to internal party decision mechanisms and can prime party interests in making decisions. Furthermore, partisanship manners of governors can lead citizens to perceive local governance activities as corrupt, develop distrust, and resign from the process of local governance. And favoritism can exist in the distribution of distribution process through party networks, including allocation of resources such as roads, building permits, agricultural equipment, supporting certain civil society groups. So the big conclusion is that parties matter. In emerging democracies, parties matter. And scholars should view parties from a different perspective. Rather than looking at their policy platforms, they should look at how parties matter, including at the local level. And partisan ties with appointed bureaucrats can enable mayors to rejuvenate hierarchical governance mechanisms and can lead other stakeholders to remain outside of the governance process. And co-partisanship with mayors matter for influencing citizen trust in local governance, which can derive from both partisan labeling effects and institutional performance. And this is also, there is some evidence in statistical evidence that I didn't present in this presentation. But moving forward, I will focus on municipal resignations, hopefully when the COVID conditions allow me to do so. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Salih. If you guys wouldn't mind, please join me in thanking him with a round of applause from offices and homes around the world. I thought the connection was actually pretty good, all things considered. So thank you. And we did have just one quick question up front. Are you able to stay on a little bit after we were supposed to wrap up in about half an hour just to continue the discussion, or do you need to hop off then?
Yes, I'll be happy to stay here.
Okay, excellent. So we'll do as much damage as we can over the next half hour, but we'll continue on. That's great. And I believe, yeah, Travis, if you'd like to, feel free to kick us off and we will go around the horn from there.
Super. Okay, thank you, Scott. And thanks, Salih. When I read this paper, I thought sometimes when I see a superb data set, I just get very excited about it. And I think you've got one. But I'm going to challenge you a little bit, and I can email you more questions later. I took a lot of notes on your paper, but let me just suggest that it feels like you're sort of, at least in the paper part, you're sort of listing responses, and you have a really rich, from what I can see, a really rich data set. So let me just pop a couple questions and then let the next person talk. And I have to find that. So if you look at in the paper that you sent out, it's figure 6, and I think in the presentation it might have been 13, but I'm not positive. It shows Sfax, Kerouan, and Tounes and transparency scores. And Tounes is off the charts. I mean, Tounes is much higher. Sfax and Kerouan, if you looked at all parties in each, it's much higher in Tounes. So I'm wondering, could you get into sort of a regional analytics? Because Tunisia, and hopefully Huda will ask a question along these lines or point something out. Tunisia it shocks me how varied it is, how varied in population terms, how varied in educational levels, how varied in economics. And you have this data, it seems. So if you could go a little bit more into regional variation, and then perhaps also, I'm curious, you don't seem to be conditioning very much with income level. And you have data inside, for instance, Tounes or Sfax or Kerouan, forgive my pronunciation, that shows the municipality subsections. So that's another sort of question. Could you do it? Could you do more regional variation, and could you actually delve inside some of the larger municipalities a bit more?
Okay, can I answer, Scott?
Of course, please. Yeah.
So regarding regional variation, I think I controlled for region. It's been a while since I wrote that chapter, but I think I controlled for the regional factors. So conditioning with income level is a great advice. So the issue is that Tunisia recently, Tunisia had 264 municipalities up until 2016. And from 2016 to 2018, they increased the municipalities to 350. But the Ministry of Local Affairs still has not published the income data for new municipalities. So the data available only is for the old municipalities. And some of the municipality performance indexes, some of the indexes, for instance, the well-being index for municipalities is still based on the old jurisdiction. So this constrains my ability to include all municipalities within the analysis. But I can try to limit my data, for instance, exclude the new municipalities and see whether the income of municipalities, for instance, the amount of support allocated from the central government matters for transparency of local governance.
May I ask something, Scott? Is that okay?
Oh, for sure. If you have a follow-up, yeah, please. Travis.
Yeah, so what I meant, I wasn't referring actually to your quantitative analytics and controlling for the region. What I'm curious about is, and this is more, because one of the cool things about your research design is you're using methods on both sides, quantitative and qualitative. And I'm curious on the qualitative side, on the interview side, could you actually delve into a little bit more through the interviews why, for instance, transparency would be so much higher in, I mean, Sfax is a rich city, and as is Tunis. So I thought that differentiation between transparency was really interesting, you know, from a social science perspective, really interesting. So that was my thought.
Yes, so I think Sfax started off with many challenges. In many municipalities in Sfax, there were resignations early on that disrupted the structure of local governance. I think some dynamics derive from the local conditions in Sfax, but in greater Tunis area, in Tunis, including Ariana too, in the greater Tunis area, you have a more dense civil society, you have greater income, so you have greater mechanisms to engage with the municipality. Furthermore, these municipalities have more staff members who can engage with, you know, ensuring the formal mechanisms of transparency. But once you look at the Sfax, you go outside the capital Sfax region, you see that, you know, the conditions are a lot more limited. So the Banlieue, the suburb areas, for instance, in Tunis are still well off to support the workings of municipalities. But, you know, the conditions are really not that great. Coupled with the partisan conflict in these municipalities, I think that it really put additional layers of challenge.
I check.
Thank you, Salih. Thanks, Travis. And we can always circle back if we need to. And I believe Renzo was next, and then Brian.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Salih, and congratulations for the great work you're doing with this project. I remember you going back a few years and pushing forward this, so it's great to see it on paper. My question was related to your to other factors that might explain the results you're seeing. And let me see. Basically, your dependent variable, your transparency index for municipalities, is built on how much the municipality, how openly the municipality shares information, right? You say 70% is focused on the right to information, which is publishing on their website certain things, responding to requests, publishing the annual report, and the other 30% is focused on governance itself, and part of it is on how openly they conduct the sessions. And you also refer to a 15% related to internal system of municipalities, which I didn't get quite what it was. But it's basically that idea, right? How much they share, how openly they are. And there's definitely, based on the data that you show, a correlation with partisanship and regional characteristics, I guess. But I was wondering if during your field work and research, have you seen something other than those variables, maybe related to the municipal capacity itself, not its resources, not its budget necessarily, but how capable the personnel are, how the infrastructure or the organizational infrastructure that the municipality has to be able to do these tasks related to transparency that you're measuring. My guess is that there must be some complacency on the part of municipal bureaucrats and governors and above, and their partisan relationship, that might give them some assurance that they can just, their position might be safe to some extent. But there might be another story about the resources that the organization, the municipal organization has, or other variables like civil society, the role of civil society, how active they are locally, putting pressure on the local government. So I was wondering if you found something related to that in your work in the field, or your own research
Yes.
over
So
there.
great question, Renzo, as always. And Travis' questions were great too. Renzo, so what I found is that, yes, whether administrative officials are experienced or not is a substantive factor. And in new municipalities that lack resources, for instance, some I think some of them scored low on transparency because they did not complete the formal procedures. However, this does not mean their governance methods is not transparent in smaller municipalities, in new municipalities. And how did I reach that conclusion? Because when I look at the resignation data, resignations are low in new municipalities. They're not necessarily high in less resourceful municipalities. And doing interviews, I also noticed that if municipalities don't have a lot of resources, and if they are in a rural area, for instance, everyone knows each other, there is a different culture. There is less rent extraction opportunities, and also everyone knows each other in a sense, and everyone tries to do something to make things work. But once you look at more municipalities in capital regions, for instance, more resourceful municipalities, what you see is that there's a lot of political gaming going on. There's some civil society trying to block mayor, some civil society doing something else. So process is a lot more complicated. So what I found is that also mayors who are not hardcore partisans, mayors who were elected from a party, who can benefit from a party's networks, yet who can also engage with the other side, who can moderate among different groups and administrative officials. Those municipalities, I think, performed the best in comparison to others. So mayor's character also is important. The administration's character is also important. Well, how much they have, how much skin in the game they have, how much established interests that they have that they try to protect. So there is a lot of things going on, as you said, indeed, that would require us to sit down for a while, but I don't want to take others' time for that. So,
Thank you, Salih. If I could, Scott, briefly.
Yeah, please, Renzo. Yep.
So those are great answers. What I would suggest, maybe in the paper, elaborate more on those other possible explanations a little bit more, if you could, to make sure that you're covering all possible situations or their combination, or maybe telling that those stories that you've seen, all these political aspects, but also the experience that the mayor might have and how that may have a role. I would even think that some municipalities might not even be capable of being as transparent as they would, or as they should, because they don't have the IT person to hire.
right.
There are not enough experts in that area that they might be able to hire to just publish the council sessions, or publish the reports, or things like that are minuscule, but can be part of minor resource in some contexts, but there might be a larger political explanation as the one you're providing. So just that I wanted to add. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you, Renzo. That was great. And Brian, over to you, sir.
Okay, good. And some of this falls on with what Renzo was talking about in terms of capability and delivery. So I've put the specific questions in the chat. Interesting paper. One part of it on the conceptual theoretical level is to what extent you're using some model of bureaucrats and politicians that goes beyond just a very simple or even simplistic Buchanan-Tulloch self-interested view of things. And that's obviously their concerns about that kind of view can unfortunately be kind of corrosive and a self-fulfilling prophecy in dangerous ways. The second part, you focus on transparency. And I don't know Tunisia, but I went to Egypt a number of times when the Brotherhood was in power. And obviously it's a complicated and difficult situation, but what was striking for me was the extent when the Brotherhood did have political control, the extent to which they really failed to deliver in tangible ways benefits to the society and both the constituency they built up when they were kind of semi-underground and so on, and the broader society, and arguably, failed in a historic opportunity to show what an elected Islamist government could deliver. So the kind of question is, aren't there maybe, transparency is very nice, it's one part of things, but maybe delivery, some other things that are much more important if Tunisia is facing the risk of, stopping being the exception among Arab regimes, and also what's happening in parts of Europe and elsewhere of this kind of authoritarian turn. Thank you.
Brian, can you reframe your first question regarding Buchanan and simplicity?
Yeah. Are you basically just using a narrow, self-interested model of how bureaucrats, aim to maximize, their rents or power or whatever? Or do you have a model that includes some people, at least, who are, sincere, ethically motivated, or workshop, Tocqueville, self-interested, rightly understood, people who take a long-term perspective, think about their reputation, or again, think about the long-term prospects of their party, being out of power and trading power back and forth in a competitive democracy, rather than just, what can we grab in the short run? So that's the first question.
So I think I need to work more on the theoretical framework, but what I assumed is that bureaucrats are utility maximizer individuals. And so they are interested in contributing to their party's prospects. They are interested in helping their co-partisans succeed, because if co-partisans, they were appointed, some of them at least were appointed to that place based on their political connections. And if their co-partisans succeed, they in a sense also achieve some of their political goals, advancing the interests of their political connections. Also, this operates in an environment, the dynamic operated in an environment of high polarization. So it was important to block other party as much as it was important to advance your party's interests. And both sides considered themselves as the rightful holders of power and resources, whether through a historical narrative or victimization narrative. So in that sense, what matters is controlling the powers, not allowing other side to take control, not allowing other side to succeed, so that our guys can win.
Okay, so then in a sense, the second question is, do they actually, is there a way in which this, could be survive as a competitive democratic system with parties trading power? Because the way you talk about it, each one is actually just ready for the time when, they can do what they're entitled to.
So I've seen some municipalities governed in really efficient ways.
Okay.
And within regions, I also observed that some mayors, for instance, told me, I am from Ennahda, the governor does not like me, he blocks everything I do. Another mayor, 20 kilometers away, also from Ennahda, same governor, he says, I have no problems with governor. But, so I think what governors check is if mayors are hyper-partisan, if they do this clientele stuff, and if mayors are hardcore members. But if the mayors are more moderate, I think the moderation is key here. If the mayors are more moderate, the both governors, don't bother them much. Also, they engage other sides too. You know, if they are skillful, if they are moderate, they engage with the dialogue. That's how they solve things. But a lot of conditions need to come together for things to work or fail. You know, it's not just matter skill or not. Mayor can be very skillful, but you can have 5 council members. For instance, if there is a council members from the leftist parties and Islamist parties in the same council, you know, there's a good chance that things will break down regardless of mayor's skills, because these guys just can't get things done. You know, so there's some opportunity, I think, for being moderate. There's some virtue for moderation here. But also regarding delivery, transparency can go against delivery. In a sense, if their self-interests are aligned, you know, governor's self-interests are aligned with mayor's self-interest, they can allocate good resources to municipalities. They can build stadiums, they can build parks, they can build culture centers, but that does not necessarily mean they include other council members or they include citizens in the process. And I think that's a paradox, in a sense that not being democratic can give you electoral benefits. So if you do things in the good old ways, as the good old ways did, you can electorally become more successful, at least in certain cases. So I think this is like a political course theorem, in a sense, that there's a loophole here that mayors can get into, that, you know, they can help them electorally, but does not necessarily advance the project of self-governance or the democracy at the local level.
Good. Thanks.
No, thanks a lot, Brian and Salih. That was excellent. As Travis mentioned, it's such a powerful, you know, data set here. I feel like you can do so much with this, and I'm wondering if you could just spend a quick minute, since we're approaching the end here, discussing, you know, both next steps, but also how this particular paper fits in with your broader, you know, research agenda. Because I'd love to learn more about where you see this heading.
So regarding transparency, I haven't considered using it other ways yet. Besides resignations and applications to municipal court. So I'm looking at whether transparency can explain how council members resign, mayors resign from councils. So less transparent governance, more resignations, in a sense. And how this project fits, I actually, when I started this project, I was thinking of Tocquevillian analysis of democracy in Tunisia. So in a sense, self-governance was my key. There was this revolution, there were these reforms, but to what extent do these factors enable people to self-govern themselves?
Right.
But so I shrank the project then to local governance, in a sense. I want to understand under which conditions local innovation, the framework is suitable for self-governance, local innovations, you know, different modes of governance fit for different local settings to thrive. So that's the goal of my project. And as I was conducting interviews, I was first looking at whether mayors served prior to revolution in Tunisia. That was my first hypothesis. Serving under the prior regime, whether their connections with the network, administrative network of the authoritarian rule enabled mayors to get into these hierarchical governance structures. Yet, as I did interviews, I noticed that it's not the prior connections that matter. It's how governors are appointed that matters. Actually, one of the council members told me he was drinking shisha in a cafe, and I was trying to explain him my theory, and he said, no, don't look at this. What matters is he came from this party. And then my whole project, in a sense, changed, and then here we are.
That's fascinating. Okay. No, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I feel like there's so many interesting comparative studies you could do, as even with some mature democracies as well, like the UK, which has been in a long running process of trying to devolve more power, to mayors, etc. But anyway, that's what I was curious in terms of more medium, longer term plans. Let's wrap this up first.
Yes.
We can take it from there. Excellent. We do have maybe just 2 or so minutes if anyone has a final thought. Yeah, Travis, please. Yep, go ahead.
So Salih, just to follow on with what Scott just said, and what you responded, I was thinking to ask you, well, one, to encourage you, Scott sort of said there's so much fascinating stuff and could it be extended? I would suggest, just as a brief, that you might go a little bit more into, maybe you do this in your dissertation, into al-Bawsala.
Yeah.
Because this is a good example of, this is one of a half a dozen reasons why Tunisia should be analyzed more in a broader global comparative politics nature, I think. And another is the variation that you do find inside that you show us inside what you tell us about in the interviews, but I haven't seen that yet in the analytics. So I think that what you explained to Renzo and also to Brian indicates that you've got some seriously good interview information. And I'll just send you a bunch of thoughts if that's okay, since we're wrapping up.
Yes, please, Travis.
Okay.
Excellent. And yeah, we'll follow the chat box here as well and give you a copy of the transcript, Salih. But William, yeah, I appreciate that comment, and Huda. Basically, you're getting lots of accolades. So well done. Well done, Salih. And I know you mentioned that you might be able to stick around for just a couple minutes if there's some follow-up, discussion as well. So we'll turn to that momentarily. But first, any final thoughts from you?
Thank you all for being here. And I think Huda is the only Tunisian. And أتمنى أن أتشكر هدى.
Shukran. That was a great paper. Thank you so much. I mean, I've learned a lot from it. I just felt, enlightened by the type of data that you collected. And there are things that I was quite surprised, especially when it comes to the partisanship, because I have always thought that some of those governors or those local, those municipal officials, might not have those partisan allegiances. I mean, I have always thought that, somebody from Ennahda could be part of could be an independent, but not being another perceived. So that's something that I've learned today, that, partisanship is really important. So that's very illuminating. Thank you so much, Salih, for that. Shukran.
Too important, as we see here as well. Thank you. This is fantastic. But one more round of applause for Salih. That was just excellent. And for those who are able to stay on, please do. As a reminder, we do have that special Teaching the Workshop, History and Methods panel in a week's time for 90 minutes. So looking forward to that. And for those who can stay on, as I said, please do. Unfortunately, I do have to run to another meeting, so I'll have to bounce off. But so good to see you, Salih, and excellent job on this research. Really exciting.